The 2003 Ang Lee directed Hulk film starring Eric Bana, Jennifer Connelly, Sam Elliott and Nick Nolte seems to be enjoying something of a critical reappraisal lately, rising from the fairly middling, generally confused reception that it was met with on its initial release to becoming more known as a flawed movie that has stood the test of time a little better than you'd expect. At least from general conversation online, that's what I seem to see whenever this film comes up over the last couple of years, especially in regard to its Hulk design, which people still have a very soft spot for. I've really enjoyed this film a lot since I was a kid, even though I totally understand that it, with its art housey and somewhat self-important tone, its long drawn-out pacing and backloaded action, was not really what people wanted at the time and was not a terrific pairing to the Raimi Spider-Mans that it clearly followed in the wake of. I do, however, think it is a film with a lot more to offer than just a surprisingly emotive animation and CGI performance from a 22-year-old film. I really think in terms of narrative merit, Hulk, while absolutely not perfect, still offers something unique to the world of superhero movies that's worth a closer look today or a revisit if you've never watched it before.
A physical wound is finite, but with emotions wants to say that it won't just go on and start a chain reaction.
Releasing the same year as both Matrix sequels as well, I happen to think of these three movies are things that time has been exceptionally kind to, both in how they still feel complete visually and how well considered they are as actual narrative explorations in their chosen arenas. At the time, these movies may not have explored the avenues that we wanted them to, but 20 years on, that feels less and less important given just how complete they are anyway. Action scenes, much less narrative, and comparable films today sometimes doesn't look or feel a fifth as powerful as what was presented here in 2003.
But then you're something else too, aren't you? My physical son. But the child of my mind too.
As far as the look of the film goes, the comic book panel style of editing and photography, while quite novel and well-meaning, I think is definitely the part of the film that's maybe aged the most significantly. I have a soft spot for the stylistic boldness of it and of the Raimi Spider-Mans as well, both lovingly scored by Danny Elfman too, but I do think the panel device here is a little kind of present merely for its own sake in a few too many circumstances. While it can be interesting on occasion, I don't know if it actually does much to improve the action or mesh particularly well with the film's on the whole fairly dramatic photographic style. It's not always effectively used, like in the cattle prod scene, just showing you two slightly different angles of the same thing, limiting the emotional intention of each. But the feeling of visual completeness and the thought in the movie overall that this device contributes to makes the entire movie just feel like a really creative piece. And a look being dated is not altogether a bad thing. Trends come and go, styles fluctuate, and having a style that is distinctly of a time I actually find more endearing these days than not. I really love a natural, grounded feeling film photographically, but the older I get, the more I find myself gravitating toward films that were definitely storyboarded within an inch of their lives, like this one. Probably comes from an affinity for animation, which this film necessarily blended with, given how much the Hulk character was involved. Now, this has been discussed a lot. The Hulk character still looks pretty damn remarkable, with 3 different sized models for him blending seamlessly both into outdoor locations in broad daylight, with various indoor locations with water, smoke interaction, grime and dust on his skin, not to mention the emotion present in his movement and interaction with physical objects during scenes, all of which is really impressive for this time, but also believable and engaging today.
He is my father. He wanted me to change. He wanted me to change into that mindless Hulk. Why would he want that?
I unfortunately do think when it comes to Bruce Banner, while I do enjoy his work as a comic actor, behind-the-scenes production seems fairly grueling for this movie. It might have been really difficult to perform under the conditions, but Eric Bana's performance in this movie I think is unfortunately fairly weak. Perhaps it's made worse by the presence of Jennifer Connelly, just doing a beautiful job as the film's real emotional center.
Bruce, this isn't funny. I was watching you. You were gonna die, and I was gonna have to watch you die.
Sam Elliott just being a pillar of status and grit.
Let's cut the crap. I'm the guy who had your father tossed away, and a lot more like him, and I'll do the same with you if I feel so disposed, you understand?
And Nick Nolte giving a singularly deranged take as David Banner.
More powerful. Stop! Stop! What? Stop! What?
three really layered and intriguing performances that are hard to stand up next to, but Banner just struggles with conveying the role of an emotionally closed-off man in a compelling way that still invites the audience in, I feel.
I had the most vivid dream. It was like being born, coming up for air, light hitting my face, screaming.
I think it harms the film more than any other aspect. He's kind of playing a character who's distant from those around him, who doesn't really understand himself very well, but has these enormous outbursts which are the core of the character, and that's difficult to perform, but essential, given that the film is more or less about his character's emotionality. I think the line deliveries on some of the cornier material from the film routinely feels clunkiest from him, and like his dramatic work since, which is fairly strong, has definitely shown that this kind of bigger budget movie, I think, isn't the kind of film that he thrives in, and I think he'd probably agree from what I've seen of him, his discussion on this film after the fact. But there are other really great touches all throughout this movie. In a world and with a genre that really loves de-aging, something I always love seeing is when casting directors nail getting an actor to make a small appearance as a younger version of a character, and I think Paul Kersey as a young David Banner in those opening scenes and later flashbacks might be one of the better examples of that I can think of. Nolte's performance later on is dialed really strangely, but Kersey melts into it extremely well, to the point where like they look and feel so much like the same character that I didn't really consider them as being two different actors until I was much older. They just feel like the same guy. These are all basic observations though. You're here for that Micah Edmonds style shit. Now, I've never read a Hulk comic book, so I'm sure he's a superhero in most places. It's really easy to criticize the film and pick it apart from that particular standpoint, that it does not hit the brief of being a superhero movie. Like the one scene where he does something superhero-y with the pilot in the plane is definitely the film's most forced moment. If you go in wanting it to be a certain type of entertaining flick, the weaknesses are obvious, but if you meet it where it's living and where it's coming from, I think it's much easier to understand, although that does mean that the back half with all the action becomes the weaker part of the film, as I personally do feel it is. So I want to try to discuss it as more of a dramatic piece today. Now, I'm not entirely sure if the interpretation of the Hulk abilities that this film has any basis in other works, but the key to understanding the movie does lie in the Hulk ability and how it manifests for Bruce Banner, abilities that within other films I think have been really under-investigated, to the point that Bruce Banner is basically just a regular guy now in the MCU who just happens to be green. Like since Thor Ragnarok, at least in the MCU, we've seen filmmakers attempt to work around the Hulk and the limitations his power set and story presents to a potential narrative through many different approaches. The benefit of earlier Hulk movie projects like 2003 up through Avengers 2 is that they are far more willing to actually interface with the character, with what makes him interesting instead of just shoving him off to the side, and never more so than here in 2003, where the entirety of the story revolves around the Hulk power and grows from it into a rich and clear thematic work with a point and a message. The Incredible Hulk is around and it's fine, but was creatively developed almost as a response to the criticisms that this film received, so it exists as a reaction to it. But what is this movie about, and how does that Hulk ability help it become what it is? Well, the Hulk, the film, doesn't necessarily say that when man becomes angry he gets big and green. It spends a lot of time at the beginning of the story speaking about the nature of the ability, showing different scientists, both Bruce Banner and his father David Banner, working on similar biological experiments which ultimately result in the Hulk ability. It's radiation-activated hormonal therapy, basically, which when used on animals amplifies the body's natural healing response to pain and injury to basically give them an accelerated healing factor. Physically, it means that cuts heal more quickly. The problem becomes that the immune system doesn't know when to stop. However, because Bruce's dad, David, experimented on himself before passing those genetic mutations down through to his son, going against military directive, that same ability kind of lay dormant in Bruce his whole life until activated by gamma radiation combined with his own research. So now he has a healing factor basically, but when inside a human, the experiment which amplifies the body's natural response to pain and injury doesn't just apply to physical wounds and injuries, it identifies emotional trauma as an injury and amplifies his natural response to it, which in this case is anger, and doesn't know when to stop. The main thing I see discussed in this film as being something people really liked a lot is that the Hulk gets bigger the angrier he gets. This is a direct effect of his immune system within the story continuing to try to heal that emotional wound by making him angrier and angrier. So the basic ability of turning green and monstrous when he's angry instead becomes Bruce's brain trying to heal itself the way that it knows how, with anger, when his mental illnesses show themselves, and this is what his body does. And with a device like that, you have yourself a recipe for a film which, through a narrative weaponization of a comic book character's superpower, investigates through it, among other things, hereditary male rage and pain, domestic abuse, emotional suppression, repressed memories, how unaddressed childhood trauma creates distance in adult relationships, aspects of the nature of parental neglect and how trauma gestates, and how a masculine society typically responds with anger to cover their pain or to deal with mental illnesses, the lasting damage that unfit fathers can inflict upon their children, and I think it's one of the most ambitious and emotionally interesting stories in a film from this genre to date as a result. It's about all of that, and it comes through the Hulk ability kind of being the central engine for the story, as being the physical form of Bruce's emotional pain inflicted onto him by his dad. And the story of how adults deal with the pain passed down from their fathers there is basically told through 4 different characters, because Bruce isn't really the only one dealing with this. You got Bruce Banner and his father David Banner, but you've also got Betty Ross and her father General Ross. These 4 characters in this film all have extremely interesting relationships and contrasting elements with each other in any combination and direction, like Betty to David or Ross to Bruce, like they all connect in different ways. It's hard to know personally which relationship of the film is the most interesting to me. They're all really layered and dependent on one another. The connection between David and Ross I think is really fiery and fun to watch, especially that little moment right there at the end. It's based on their earlier life in the military, where David had ignored Ross's directive, blew up the military lab to hide his research, tried to kill his own son but accidentally killed his wife. Ross obviously holds a grudge against the guy, perhaps seeing it as a failure of his ability to protect those around him on his base, but that ire now extends to Bruce as an adult, who is close to Betty, Ross's daughter. Ross can't help but see the same things in Bruce, even if they're completely different people, and holds the sins of the father against the son. David is similarly driven against Betty, but more so because he recognizes the influence of a romantic connection to supersede the power that he personally might wield over Bruce. David's own wife, in his words, was like his Achilles heel. The only reason he didn't kill Bruce as a baby to stop the genetic mutation was because of how happy his wife was to have a child and how happy she made him. So David holds a grudge against Ross, absolutely, for putting him in prison for 30 years away from his son, but sees Betty as a more direct enemy because she has a greater capacity to reach Bruce than he does, and sees his own son as the reason why his wife is dead, who in his own words was everything that ever mattered to him. But of the relationships, it's Betty and Bruce's that's the most central to the narrative. At some point recently, prior to the start of the film, their romantic connection had deteriorated, they're not romantic partners during the film, and the culprit is discussed as being Bruce's emotional distance. His inability to let Betty in, properly, and be vulnerable with her gets in the way. Perhaps her flaw is that she sees that distance as something to be conquered, as also an echo of her relationship with her father, whose distance has left them estranged. This in particular is shown in Betty's recurring dream. At first a moment on the military base where her father leaves her for his duty, responding to the explosion that David set off, and the arms that comfort her in that moment are those of a similarly distant man who's ultimately the death of her. Her father's emotional distance left her feeling abandoned, but unfortunately the next man she really cared about is just as far away. We can see Betty and her father's first interaction actually shows the different sides of that connection through different photographic lenses. Ross's approach to them is more professional and clinical, and Betty just wants to be with her dad. Photographically, it shows that difference by shooting their exchange on both sides of the line of action here. Shooting the reverse shot conversation from this side of the table when they're being unconnected adults, but then from this side when they're father and daughter. It actually cuts between them in the middle of sentences to show you that difference.
Look, I'm gonna get right to it.
Are you here to question me?
No.
I think I was hoping that maybe this time you just honestly wanted to see me again.
If you'd like to see more about the line of action and how it can be used like that, check out my video essay on the movie Tar, currently a Patreon exclusive, which uses the line of action as a central storytelling and character device throughout the entire film. But here in Hulk, the trick to Betty and Bruce is that their relationship may have been romantic, but it's ongoing. They're co-workers and need to continue interacting while that history and intent kind of plays in the undertow. There's a raw feeling from Betty, making these digs and jabs which betray that while she left Bruce, there's still a a deep desire to connect with him that indicates that she had tried for a long time to get through and is just finding it hard to drop the habit. I think that's pretty believably written. The whole story can kind of be read through the lens of that relationship, of how the Hulk form manifests as Bruce's emotions from which he's tried to distance himself, the trauma of his past and the neglect, the bad parts of himself handed down by an abusive parent, but how those are the parts of him that Betty is actually trying to see and trying to help him work through to achieve a real, genuine connection with him. Hulk, the movie, is largely about the nature of being completely vulnerable with someone, whether that's a parent who doesn't understand the nature of that vulnerability or would seek to exploit it, or the pure beauty and love when someone sees you for all that you are and accepts you completely. A film about two adult people who need to be willing to confront the aspects of themselves which are really uncomfortable, whether it's Betty's need for emotional investment from men who've hurt her, or Bruce's deeply repressed trauma and pain, and their need for mutual vulnerability that can't just be one-sided. Bruce needs to learn to let Betty see the parts of himself that he hides, because unless he does, he'll lose the only person who actually understands him. It also shows how a parent can kind of get underneath your skin and get to those hidden places of you faster than anyone else and kind of change them into something that they're not. Hulk is seen at multiple points being very calm and at peace with the world around him. His rage comes from his trauma being exacerbated by people who want to taunt him. The later part of the film demonstrates this pretty well, even during the action. The beauty of nature that Hulk is trying to observe. He's fully capable of existing in the world peacefully in his pain. It's when other people try to turn that into something for their own ends where he is like defiant. The imagery early in the film also evokes a lot of the nature versus nurture conversation around that same feeling, and the continual photographic emphasis on geology and plants, small examples of nature contained in small spaces, trees breaking through rock. It calls into mind later on questions about how much of the Hulk, like the going green, was given to Bruce and how much of it is genuinely him. And when we see David's absorbing powers later on, that becomes a more literal thing. David can become a part of Bruce, and Bruce needs to find where he and his trauma and actual pain begins and ends relative to the influence of a malcontent who's seeking to make it worse.
Do you really believe that I am separate from you?
In classic Micah Edmonds fashion, it's a friggin' metaphor, bruh. So even though like the dogfight is pretty cool, even if a bit Scooby-Doo, the moments of like Betty seeing and recognizing Bruce before it happens, Betty's decision to stay in the car when she could have run away, while he fights to both show himself but also protect her from the worst of his father's mistakes, adds this like small emotional significance to their relationship through the middle of a fight scene. It becomes a scene of Bruce attempting to, for the first time, genuinely show her the parts of him that she's been asking for, his actual hurt and the pieces of himself that he needs to heal, his anger, his capacity to harm, the pain that his father handed down, while he's still trying to keep her safe from it. Like that interaction before the fight, there's something very childlike about Hulk. He's like, there's something very King Kong about it. I think that's probably quite intentional.
Bruce. My Bruce.
Earlier in the film, how little Bruce as a baby in the cage is immediately evocative of the monkey in the box being gassed, shows you David Banner's nature pretty well straight away. For a film that's definitely artsier than most superhero projects these days, it's still fairly on the nose when you know what to look for like that. There might be some part of David that does love Bruce, but the film hereafter just shows you that David more or less considers Bruce his property, his experiment, his thing to own and reclaim. The nature of an abusive parent not seeing their child as being an independent person, like a separate thing from them.
My Bruce.
The answer the film provides is pretty simple and quite elegant, that the nature of emotional pain only really has one solution, and it's the genuine chosen connection with people. The trauma itself never really ends, that pain doesn't heal, the body doesn't know when to stop trying to fix the bit of you that's been hurt, but when you find people who accept that part of you, when you accept it yourself, you understand it and are able to look past it with someone, like that's where the real path forward lies. The chosen vulnerability is actually your greatest strength.
You found me.
You weren't that hard to find.
Yes, I was.
But to summarize how I feel about the Hulk movie, we can go all the way back to Bruce's first Hulk out, where he destroys that nanomed machine. And the brief image of him as Atlas holding up the sky might be the most perfect image for how I think this film sits within superhero movies from maybe specifically Marvel today. In any MCU film, such a deliberate piece of imagery would feel uncalled for, outside the vocabulary, and definitely not played sincerely. They'd laugh at this, even if they did it. None of them these days would risk using such a heavy-handed device without hanging a lantern on it. But I honestly think it kind of fits here. The film earns that moment. Bruce had been, for his whole life until that point, keeping his emotional pain locked in a room. And given that the nanomeds, gamma radiation, that experiment is a physical thing which represents the genesis point of his pain, that he gets frustrated trying to break it apart, instead tries to hold it up, fumbles, and then throws it through a fucking wall, feels oddly earned, natural, poignant, and comical all at once. It's not Shakespeare, but Hulk did a lot of really ambitious things, and it definitely pulls most of them off by being willing to do that kind of thing with sincerity and allow itself to be seen doing it, to be seen trying. Whether it's the visuals and the character of Hulk himself and how remarkably that's held up in many ways, or the tight tapestry of 4 opposing characters, each with compelling motivations and history and relationships to each other, human depth, and mostly solid performances, I think Hulk remains a titan of a film, while using the language of a comic book character in a compelling way to genuinely engage with substantive material. Hulk becomes an outlier of the genre. Perhaps it's a bit disinterested in the blockbuster entertainment appeal that most people, I think, go into a movie of this type wanting to find. But much like Jessica Jones or The Boys would later carry on, it really showed early on-screen comic universe adaptations and their ability to tackle regions of relevant, deeply human narrative that had kind of previously been untouched. And Hulk did it 10 years before anyone else really tried again, so even if you're not into it, I still think you gotta tip the hat. So if it's been a while since you watched Hulk, or you've never seen it at all, I hope this convinced you that it's worth a revisit or a reassessment. Open the door maybe on some thinking about the cool, interesting stuff that it does, because I definitely think that it's worth a rewatch. Thank you so much for visiting my channel. Make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, check out my Patreon as well, and I'll see you next time.